Hello there, and welcome back to Midnight Creaks. While most of the world counts down to midnight with champagne and celebration, there are places in the Pacific Northwest where the towering forests and isolated mountain towns hold darker traditions. In the shadow of Douglas firs and fog-shrouded ravines, where logging roads disappear into wilderness and small communities cling to the edges of vast ancient forests, something waits for New Year's Eve. From a park ranger's final radio transmission about empty tents in a blizzard, to Polaroid photographs documenting years of holiday murders, to forensic evidence that was deliberately buried by those sworn to find the truth. Before we venture into these 5 disturbing true stories from the Pacific Northwest, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a tale from the darkness. And if you've ever experienced something unexplainable in these deep forests, share your story in the comments below. We read every single one. Now turn off the lights, pull your curtains closed, and let the countdown begin. They told us she went over the edge drunk, but the dog kept dragging us back into the trees. That was New Year's Eve 2011, and I still think about it every time I hear a siren after midnight. I'm from a small town in Oregon about 40 miles east of Eugene. Most people have never heard of it, and that's probably for the best. Population maybe 3,000 if you counted the folks living out in the hills. I was 23 at the time, working as a volunteer firefighter and EMT. In a town our size, everyone wears multiple hats. You work your day job and then you're on call for whatever emergency rolls in. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked helping people. I liked feeling useful. I'd been doing it for about 2 years at that point, and I thought I'd seen everything. Bar fights, car accidents, heart attacks, the usual small town emergencies. I was wrong. New Year's Eve was always busy. Bar fights, drunk drivers, fireworks accidents, hypothermia cases. We joked that midnight was amateur hour. People who couldn't hold their liquor suddenly thought they were invincible. That year started out pretty typical. A couple of minor calls, nothing serious. Some kid burned his hand with a sparkler. An elderly woman slipped on her icy porch. Standard stuff. I was actually hoping to catch the countdown on TV with my buddy Lyle, who was working dispatch that night. We had pizza and everything. A couple of sodas. We were planning to toast with cheap champagne at midnight, but at around 11:30 p.m. the call came in that changed everything. Lyle's face went serious as he listened to the caller. I could tell from his expression it wasn't good. When he hung up, he looked at me and said, "We had a possible fall up on Fireline Road. Female, intoxicated, unresponsive. Possible injury or worse." I felt my stomach drop. Fireline Road wasn't really a road anymore. It was an old Forest Service route that wound up into the mountains through dense Douglas fir forest. It had been decommissioned years ago after budget cuts, but the locals still used it. Kids used it as a party spot, especially the turnouts that overlooked the ravines. The drop-offs up there were steep, some of them 100 feet or more straight down into rocky creek beds. If someone went over drunk in the dark, they weren't coming back. Not alive anyway. I grabbed my gear and met the ambulance driver Gavin outside. He was older, maybe 50, and he'd been doing this for decades. Vietnam vet, seen everything. He didn't say much as we loaded up, just nodded and started the engine. The drive up was tense. The road was narrow and icy, winding through trees so thick they blocked out the stars. It felt like driving through a tunnel. Our radios kept cutting in and out because of the terrain. I could hear fireworks, popping in the distance, echoing up from town, people celebrating, laughing, counting down. It felt wrong somehow, like the celebration was mocking what we were about to find. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. Our headlights cut through the blackness, but barely. The trees pressed in on both sides. I remember thinking how isolated it was up there, how far from help, how easy it would be for something to go wrong, and nobody would know for hours. When we finally reached the turnout, I could see a handful of cars parked haphazardly along the shoulder. Most of them had their headlights off. A few teenagers were standing near the guardrail, huddled together. Their breath came out in clouds. Most of the party had already scattered. That's how it always went. Something bad happens and suddenly everyone remembers they have somewhere else to be. Nobody wants to be there when the cops show up. Nobody wants to answer questions. Gavin parked the ambulance and we got out. The cold hit me immediately. It was one of those nights where the air just bites into you. I could feel it in my lungs. My fingers went numb almost instantly, even with gloves on. I grabbed my med kit and flashlight and headed toward the group of kids. A guy stumbled toward us. He was maybe 19, dressed in a puffy jacket that looked too big for him. His face was red from the cold or the alcohol or both. He reeked of cheap beer and his words slurred together as he tried to explain what happened. He kept saying his friend Melody had been drinking and she got too close to the edge and she just fell. He pointed at the guardrail like that explained everything, like it was simple. I asked him where exactly she went over and he waved vaguely toward a section about 20 feet away. Something about his tone bothered me. He sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing what to say. I walked over to the guardrail with my flashlight. Gavin followed a few steps behind. The first thing I noticed was a single high heel sitting neatly on the ground, right next to the metal rail. Not tossed, not kicked off in a hurry, just placed there like someone had taken it off carefully. It was a black stiletto, the kind you'd wear to a party. There was a smear of blood on the top of the guardrail, dark and fresh. It hadn't frozen yet, which meant it was recent. The snow around the area was scuffed up, like there had been a struggle or someone had slipped. But when I leaned over the edge and shined my light down into the ravine, I didn't see a slide path. If someone had tumbled down drunk, there should have been broken branches, disturbed snow, some kind of trail marking their descent. Instead, I just saw crushed brush in two weird lanes, like something heavy had been dragged parallel to the edge, not over it, like someone had carried something. That's when it hit me. This didn't look like a fall. I called Gavin over and he saw it too. He didn't say anything, but I could see his jaw tighten. His eyes narrowed. We started looking around more carefully. That's when I spotted the droplets in the snow. Tiny dark spots, leading away from the guardrail, not toward the ravine, but back toward the tree line. Blood. I followed them with my flashlight. They formed a faint trail disappearing into the shadows of the forest. My heart started racing. I told Gavin I was going to check it out. He nodded and said he'd stay back to question the remaining kids, get their stories, see if anyone knew what really happened. I stepped over the guardrail and moved carefully into the trees. The snow was deeper here, untouched, except for the tracks I was following. I could see footprints, two distinct sets. One was small and staggered, like someone barefoot or in socks, stumbling, struggling. The prints were shallow and uneven, like whoever made them was being pulled or dragged between steps. The other was heavy and straight. Boot prints. Deep ones like the person wearing them was carrying extra weight. They followed the smaller tracks, stalking them. But that's not what made my blood run cold. There was a third set of marks. At first I thought they were dog tracks. Maybe a stray that wandered through. But the more I looked at them, the less sense they made. They were too big for a dog. The stride was wrong. 4 distinct impressions, but spaced out in a way that didn't match any animal I knew. The claws, if that's what they were, left deep gouges in the snow, longer than any canine track I'd ever seen. They wove in and out of the human prints like whatever made them had been circling, following both sets of footprints. There were places where the tracks stopped completely, like whatever it was had just stood there, watching, waiting. I knelt down to get a closer look. The prints were fresh, made around the same time as the others. In a few spots, the snow was disturbed in a weird pattern, like something had brushed against it. I couldn't figure out what kind of animal moved like that. The spacing was all wrong. It almost looked like something walking on 2 legs, then dropping to 4, then back to 2. That didn't make any sense. My heart started pounding. You know that feeling when your gut tells you something is very, very wrong? That primal instinct that screams at you to pay attention? That's what I felt right then. I kept following the prints deeper into the forest. The fireworks from town sounded muffled, now almost dreamlike. I was maybe 50 yards in when the tracks became even stranger. The animal prints crossed over themselves multiple times, creating this chaotic pattern. Like whatever it was had been agitated or excited. There were spots where it looked like the creature had stood on its hind legs. The marks were deeper there, compressed into the snow with more weight. I'm telling you, I've lived in Oregon my whole life. I've seen bear tracks, cougar tracks, coyote tracks. This wasn't any of those. I kept going until the trail ended abruptly at a small clearing. The snow here was disturbed like someone had kneeled for a long time, like they'd been doing something. The animal tracks were everywhere here, circling the clearing over and over. In the center where someone had knelt, the prints came within inches. Like whatever it was had been right there, watching while someone did something to Melody. There were more blood droplets and something else. A small square of duct tape frozen into the crust. I picked it up carefully with my gloved hand. One side was sticky, and there were a few dark hairs stuck to it. Long hairs. Brown. My stomach turned. I radioed Gavin and told him what I found. My voice was shaking. He said he'd call it in and request K9 units. We needed dogs. We needed more people. This wasn't a simple fall. This was something else. By the time I got back to the turnout, more people had arrived. Sheriff's deputies with their cruisers parked at angles, another EMT crew, a couple of volunteer searchers from town. The drunk guy who'd first talked to us was gone. Disappeared. One of the girls who'd stayed behind a blonde kid named April pulled me aside. She was shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. She told me quietly that Melody had been arguing with a guy earlier that night, some dude named Brody who'd driven up from Springfield. She said he'd been hitting on Melody all night, and she kept shutting him down. She wasn't interested. Things got heated. Brody got angry, started yelling. April said Melody told him to leave her alone, and he stormed off. April hadn't seen him since. She thought he'd left, but now she wasn't sure. I asked her what kind of car Brody drove. She said a dark blue pickup. Older model? Maybe a Chevy or a Ford. She couldn't remember exactly. Then I asked her something else. I asked if anyone at the party had brought a dog. She looked at me confused and said no. Nobody had a dog. Why would they bring a dog to a party? I didn't answer her. I just looked back at the tree line. I radioed the information about Brody to the sheriff's office. They said they'd look into it, but their priority was finding Melody, getting a search party organized. The K-9 unit finally showed up around 1 a.m. The handler was a woman named Louise. She looked ex-military, short hair, serious face. She had a German shepherd named Ranger. Beautiful dog, well-trained. She let the dog sniff around the guardrail first. Ranger caught something immediately pulling hard toward the edge like he was supposed to. Everyone seemed satisfied. See? The dog confirms it. She fell, just like the kid said. But then something strange happened. Ranger started whining, a high-pitched, anxious sound. He pulled away from the guardrail and dragged Louise back toward the tree line where I'd found the trail. He was agitated, pawing at the snow and barking. Louise tried to calm him, but he wouldn't stop. She followed him into the forest, and I went with them. My flashlight cut through the darkness. Ranger led us straight to the clearing where I'd found the duct tape. When we got there, Ranger froze. His whole body went stiff. The fur on his back stood straight up, and he started growling. Not at the clearing, at something beyond it, deeper in the trees. Louise had to physically pull him away. She said in all her years working K-9, she'd never seen Ranger react like that. He was a trained search and rescue dog. He didn't spook easy. But something out there had terrified him. He circled the disturbed snow, whining the whole time, refusing to go near the center where I'd found the duct tape. His tail was tucked. His ears were back. Louise looked at me, and I could see the concern in her eyes. She said this wasn't a fall. This was something else. Something bad. Then she noticed the tracks. She bent down and examined them with her flashlight. She was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said she didn't know what made those marks. She'd worked with dogs her whole life. She knew animal tracks. These didn't match anything she'd ever seen. We searched for hours, combing through the forest, calling Melody's name, shining lights into every shadow. But we found nothing. No body, no more blood, no signs of where she'd gone. Each official search was called off around 3 a.m. The sheriff said the terrain was too dangerous in the dark and we'd resume at first light. I knew what that meant. They were giving up. They'd already decided Melody had fallen into the ravine and the body would turn up downstream eventually, maybe in the spring thaw. Case closed. Accident. Tragic but simple. No foul play. Just a drunk girl who made a stupid decision. I rode back down the mountain with Gavin in silence. My stomach felt cold and heavy. I kept thinking about those footprints, about the duct tape, about Brody who'd vanished, about those other tracks that didn't make sense. When we got back to the station, I asked Lyle if he could pull up Brody's information. He hesitated. It wasn't exactly protocol. But then he did it anyway. Brody's address was in Springfield, but the truck was registered to a P.O. box. That felt off. Why would someone register a vehicle to a P.O. box? Lyle said he'd pass it along to the sheriff's office. Let them handle it. The next day I drove back up to Fireline Road on my own. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The turnout was empty, except for the yellow caution tape fluttering in the wind. The snow had started to melt a little in the sun. I walked back into the forest to the clearing. The snow had been trampled by search crews, but I could still see the outline of where someone had knelt. I looked for the animal tracks, but they were mostly gone, trampled over by all the boots. I did find one clear print, though, away from the main clearing. I took a photo of it with my phone. When I got home, I compared it to every animal track database I could find online. Nothing matched. The spacing was wrong. The claw marks were too long. The gait pattern made no sense. I stood there for a long time trying to piece it together. What if Brody had followed Melody into the trees? What if he'd grabbed her, taped her mouth shut, dragged her back to his truck while everyone else was lighting sparklers and counting down to midnight? But what about the other tracks? What was out there in the forest that night? Was it watching Brody? Was it following him? Or was it something else? Entirely. Maybe it was just a dog after all, some stray with deformed paws. That's what I told myself. That's what I still tell myself. Brody left town within a week. I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved to California. Just packed up and left. No charges were ever filed. The sheriff's office said there wasn't enough evidence, no body, no crime scene. Just a missing girl and a bunch of teenagers who'd been too drunk to remember anything useful. I tried to bring up the tracks. The ones that didn't match anything, they brushed it off. Said it was probably just a dog, maybe a bear. I showed them the photo I'd taken. They barely looked at it. They'd already made up their minds about what happened. The official story stayed the same. Melody wandered drunk, slipped over the guardrail, fell into the ravine. Her body was never recovered, but over the years, remains started turning up downstream. A femur in 2013, part of a skull in 2015, a few other bones, scattered across different locations. Never enough to prove anything, never enough to reopen the case. The DNA matched Melody, but that just confirmed what everyone already believed. She fell. End of story. I still drive Fireline Road sometimes. I count the skid marks near that turnout. There are 3 sets, and none of them line up with the story we were told. I think about April and how scared she looked when she told me about the argument. I think about Ranger whining and pawing at that clearing, his fur standing on end, his eyes fixed on something in the trees. I think about the duct tape with the hairs stuck to it. I think about the boot prints following the smaller tracks, and I think about those other prints. The ones that shouldn't have been there. The ones nobody could explain. Every New Year's Eve when the fireworks start, I can't help but picture it. A group of drunk kids laughing and lighting sparklers while someone loads a limp body into the back of a dark blue pickup. While someone drives away into the forest, down some logging road, and everyone else is too wasted to notice. While a girl named Melody disappears, and the only ones who know the truth are the trees and whoever took her. And maybe something else. Something that was out there in the dark, watching, circling, waiting. I don't celebrate New Year's anymore. I can't. Every time the clock strikes midnight, I'm back on that frozen turnout, staring at a high heel that was placed too carefully. I'm back in those trees, following footprints that tell a story no one wants to hear. I'm back in that clearing where something terrible happened and everyone just decided to call it an accident because that was easier than admitting we failed her. I'm back there looking at tracks that don't belong to any animal I know. Tracks that still give me nightmares. Who does that? Who takes someone and makes them vanish while the whole world is counting down? And why Fireline Road? Why that night? Was it planned? Or was it opportunity? Did Brody go up there knowing what he was going to do, or did it just happen in the moment? And what else was out there? What made those tracks? What was Ranger so afraid of? I don't have answers. I don't think I ever will. But I know what I saw. I know what Ranger smelled. I know what Louise couldn't identify, and I know Brody never came back. Some falls aren't really falls. Some disappearances aren't really accidents. And sometimes there are things in the forest that we can't explain. Things that watch from the shadows. Things that leave tracks that don't match anything in the books. And some New Year's Eves you spend the rest of your life trying to forget. I've photographed over 100 murder scenes in my career. Most of them blur together after a while. The blood patterns, the chalk outlines, the everyday objects frozen in place around something terrible. But there's one scene I still think about, especially this time of year. It was the only time I felt like the room was analyzing me back. This happened in January 2005, technically New Year's Day, but the murders took place on New Year's Eve. I was working as a crime scene tech and forensic photographer for the state police out of Helena, Montana. We got the call around 9 a.m. on the 1st. A ranger station in a mountain town about 2 hours north had missed their midnight check-in. That wasn't unusual by itself. Radio equipment fails, people fall asleep after a few drinks, it happens. But when the relief rangers snowshoed out to the cabin that morning and found what was inside, everything changed fast. 3 bodies, all shot execution style. The call came through our office, and within an hour I was in a helicopter with the major crimes unit heading toward the mountains. The weather was brutal. Clear skies, but bitterly cold. The kind of cold that makes your lungs ache. Below us, the forest stretched out in every direction, just miles and miles of snow-covered pines and larches. I remember thinking how easy it would be to disappear out there. The cabin sat alone in a clearing surrounded by dense trees. No other structures for miles. It was one of those old ranger outposts, probably built in the 50s with log walls and a tin roof, sagging under the weight of snow. Smoke had stopped coming from the chimney hours ago, and the whole place had this stillness to it that felt wrong. When we landed, the snow came up past my boots, and the silence was oppressive. No birds, no wind, just the muffled crunch of our footsteps. Inside was worse. The lead detective went in first, and I followed with my equipment. The scene was eerily tidy. Christmas lights were still plugged into a small generator, casting a warm glow across the main room. A card table in the center was set for a New Year's Eve celebration. Half-eaten snacks, paper plates, a cheap champagne bottle open with only one glass showing a trace of lipstick. Everything looked normal except for the bodies. 2 victims were slumped at the table. The third was by the door, as if he'd been standing when it happened. All 3 had been shot once in the head, contact or near contact range. There were no bullet holes in the walls, no extra casings rolling around, no signs of a struggle. It was clean. Too clean. I'd never seen anything like it. Whoever did this had total control of the situation. I started my work methodically, wide shots first, then close-ups, documenting everything. The detective was quiet, taking notes, but I could tell something was bothering him. That's when I noticed the wall. The entire back wall of the cabin was covered in Polaroids. I mean, hundreds of them pinned in neat rows, like some kind of archive. It hadn't been mentioned in the initial briefing, and I stopped mid-shot to stare at it. The detective saw me looking and told me to document it carefully. I approached, slowly pulling out my macro lens. The early photos seemed normal enough. wildlife shots, summer trail crews, hikers posing with backpacks, standard ranger stuff. But as I moved along the wall following the chronological order, the images started to shift. More solo hikers appeared, almost always photographed at dusk or dawn. Their faces were slightly blurred, like the camera had caught them mid-motion or maybe the exposure was off. Something about them felt wrong. I recognized a few faces. They matched missing persons bulletins I'd seen over the years. Young people who'd vanished while hiking in Montana, cases that had gone cold. My stomach tightened. I glanced at the detective and he nodded grimly. He saw it too. The photos continued across the wall and the content grew stranger. Night shots of the cabin itself taken from just outside the windows. The 3 victims were visible in some of them, laughing, setting the table, completely unaware they were being watched. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Whoever took these had been stalking them, documenting them, waiting. Then I reached the final row. My hands started shaking and I had to steady myself against the wall. The last Polaroid was time-stamped 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes before midnight. It was taken from inside the cabin looking toward the door. The 3 victims were seated exactly as their bodies were found, but they were still alive in the photo. Their eyes had this tightness to them, like they knew something terrible was about to happen. And behind them, through the window, I could see a tall figure in winter gear standing at the tree line, just standing there watching. I stepped back and forced myself to breathe. That's when it hit me. When we'd processed the exterior of the cabin, there were no corresponding footprints outside that window. None. Not even under the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Either someone had meticulously covered their tracks, or the figure had never been there at all. Neither explanation made me feel better. The lead detective walked over and I showed him the photo. His face went white. He stared at it for a long moment, then quietly ordered me to bag the entire wall as evidence. His voice was tight when he told me not to catalog the final row in my official report. Just photograph it, bag it, and don't mention it in the write-up. I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. This wasn't a suggestion. We finished processing the scene in silence. The bodies were removed, evidence was collected, and by late afternoon we were back in the helicopter. On the flight back, I couldn't stop thinking about that final photo. Who took it? Why were the victims posed like that? And what happened to all those other hikers? The official story released to the public was vague. A robbery or poaching dispute gone bad. The case remained technically open, but no real investigation followed. I heard through the grapevine that locals were told not to worry, that it was an isolated incident. A few months later, the cabin was decommissioned. By summer, it had been burned down, supposedly for safety reasons. I didn't buy it. I kept one duplicate photo. I'm not supposed to have it, but I made a copy before turning in the evidence. It's from earlier in the collection. Maybe 3 New Year's Eves before the murders. It shows a different hiker, a young woman with a red backpack, smiling at the camera. She's standing on a trail with pine trees behind her. At the edge of the frame, partially obscured by shadows, is the same tall figure in winter gear, just watching. The woman has no idea they're there. I ran her face through missing persons databases. She vanished in January 2002. Last seen heading into the mountains for a solo winter hike. They never found her. I still don't know what to make of it all. The official explanation doesn't hold up. 3 people executed with military precision. A wall of evidence documenting years of surveillance and possible murders, and then the whole thing gets swept under the rug. Nobody from the department wants to talk about it. When I've tried to bring it up, I've been shut down fast. What bothers me most is the timing. New Year's Eve. Every single photo on that wall that showed the mysterious figure was taken around the holidays. The missing hikers all disappeared in late December or early January. It's like whoever did this had a tradition, something they did to celebrate the new year. And that cabin was their hunting ground. I wonder how many times they stood in those woods watching through the windows while people counted down to midnight. How many photos are still out there, hidden in some other cabin or buried in the snow? And I wonder if they're still doing it. Every New Year's Eve, I think about those 3 people sitting at that table with champagne and paper plates, completely unaware that someone was inside with them taking pictures, that in 2 minutes, they'd all be dead. I don't work in forensics anymore. I left the field a year after that case. Officially, I say it was for personal reasons, but the truth is I couldn't shake the feeling that some scenes never really close. That wall of Polaroids is still out there somewhere, locked in an evidence room that nobody opens. And somewhere in the Montana mountains, there might be someone still holding a camera, still waiting for midnight, still celebrating the new year, the only way they know how. We thought we were hauling out deer bones for the lab. Nobody ever logged the New Year's Eve teeth. This happened back in December of 1989. I was a grad student at a small college in Washington State studying anthropology. The campus was tucked into one of those Pacific Northwest towns where everything feels perpetually damp and gray, where the forests press right up against the edge of civilization. I'd been working as a teaching assistant for Professor George Simmons, a well-respected physical anthropologist who specialized in comparative osteology. If you don't know what that is, it's basically the study of bones, how they differ between species, what marks they carry, that sort of thing. Simmons had this project going where he wanted to build up the department's teaching collection. We needed more skeletal specimens for students to study and compare. The problem was buying those from suppliers cost money the department didn't have. His solution was to collect bones from a local dumping site. Apparently for decades, people in the area had been tossing animal carcasses and trash down this ravine on the outskirts of town. Hunters would dump deer remains. Farmers would get rid of livestock that died, that kind of thing. Simmons got permission from the county to go collect whatever we could find that might be useful. I wasn't thrilled about spending my New Year's Eve afternoon trudging through mud and rotting carcasses, but I needed the extra credit. My fellowship depended on keeping my grades up and staying in Simmons's good graces. Plus, he promised we'd be done by early evening, so I could still make it to the party my roommate was throwing. I figured a few hours of unpleasant work was worth it. The site was about 20 minutes outside of town down a logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. Simmons drove his old Jeep with me and another student named Brian Hughes, squeezed into the cab. The sky was that typical Washington winter gray, heavy and low, with a light drizzle that made everything slick. We parked at the end of the road where the forest got too thick to drive any further. From there, it was maybe a quarter-mile hike through dense underbrush to reach the ravine. I remember the smell hit us before we even saw it. That thick, sour stench of decay mixed with wet earth and rotting vegetation. Brian gagged and Simmons just laughed, telling us we'd get used to it. The ravine itself was maybe 30 feet deep, with steep walls, lined with ferns and moss-covered logs. At the bottom was this jumbled mess of bones, beer bottles, rusted car parts, and decomposed trash. It looked like the town's dirty secret. Everything people didn't want to deal with just hurled into this crack in the earth and forgotten about. Simmons had brought heavy-duty trash bags and latex gloves. The plan was simple. Climb down, sort through the mess, bag anything that looked like it might be useful for the collection, haul it back up. He was mostly interested in skulls and long bones that were intact enough for students to handle. We spent the first hour just picking through surface-level stuff. Deer skulls, raccoon skeletons, a few cow vertebrae. Brian was terrible at identifying anything, so Simmons kept having to correct him. I'd always been good at bone identification. It came naturally to me, if that makes sense. The deeper we dug, the worse the smell got. There were layers to this dump, years and years of accumulation. We found bones that were ancient and bleached white alongside fresher remains that still had bits of tissue clinging to them. Simmons worked methodically, labeling bags with masking tape and a Sharpie, noting what he thought each specimen was: deer mandible, elk femur, dog skull. He'd toss the bags up to the top of the ravine, and we'd collect them later when we climbed back up. I was maybe 2 hours in, hands filthy despite the gloves. When I picked up a bag, Simmons had just labeled deer assorted. Something about it felt wrong. The weight distribution was off. I'd handled enough deer bones by that point to know how they should feel, and this wasn't it. One of the long bones inside was too smooth, too perfectly cylindrical. I held it up to what little light filtered through the trees. There was a mark on the shaft, a clean straight line that looked like a saw cut. Not the jagged tear you get from a predator or the rough chop from a hatchet. A saw, a fine-toothed saw. I didn't say anything right away. I thought maybe I was wrong, that I was just tired and seeing things that weren't there. But then I opened the bag. Right on top was a mandible, a lower jaw. It was small, delicate, with a curved horseshoe shape that was unmistakable. Human. The teeth were still intact, adult molars with a silver amalgam filling glinting in the back. My stomach dropped. I looked over at Simmons, but he was on the other side of the ravine. It bent over a pile of rusted metal, completely absorbed in his work. Brian was further, up near the edge, catching his breath. I knelt down in the mud, my heart starting to pound. Slowly, I reached into the bag and pulled out more bones. Phalanges, finger bones. They'd been disarticulated, cut cleanly at the joints with that same precision I'd seen on the long bone. These weren't ancient remains. The bones were stained but not fossilized, relatively recent. I felt my hands start to shake. That's when I saw the sneaker. It was wedged under a rotting log, maybe 5 feet from where I was kneeling. The fabric was decomposed and covered in mud, but the rubber sole was still intact. I crawled over, my gloves squelching in the muck, and pulled it free. Inside the tongue, there was a logo, a brand I recognized. My older brother had worn the same style back in the mid-'80s. These couldn't be more than a few years old. I dropped the shoe like it had burned me. My mind was racing. This wasn't some historical burial site. This was recent. This was someone who'd been alive in my lifetime. I looked around the ravine with new eyes, scanning for anything else that didn't belong. That's when I noticed the arrangement on a higher ledge about 10 feet to my left. Beer bottles, maybe 8 or 9 of them, set in a rough circle around a blackened log. At first I thought it was just more trash, but then I saw the ashes, the remnants of a fire. Someone had been partying down here. I climbed up to the ledge, my boots slipping on the slick rocks. Mixed in with the ashes was something that made my blood run cold. A plastic crown, the cheap kind they hand out at New Year's Eve parties, melted and fused to a fragment of bone. I recognized the design. There was a nightclub in town called The Countdown that gave those out every year. They'd only opened in 1985 or 1986, I couldn't remember exactly, but it meant this was recent, very recent. My breathing was coming fast now, shallow and panicked. I heard Simmons call my name from below. I looked down and saw him staring up at me, probably wondering why I'd wandered off. I climbed back down, my legs shaking, and picked up the bag with the mandible. I carried it over to him. When I showed him what was inside, his face went white. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the bones in my hands. Then he told me to put everything back in the bag. His voice was tight, controlled in a way that scared me more than if he'd yelled. He said he'd handle it, that he'd call the proper authorities once we got back to campus. He told Brian and me to finish collecting what we'd already bagged, and that we were leaving. We didn't argue. We scrambled up the side of the ravine, grabbed the bags we'd thrown up, and hauled them back to the Jeep. The ride back was silent. Simmons didn't say a word, and neither did Brian or I. When he dropped us off at the campus parking lot, he reminded us not to discuss what we'd found with anyone. He'd take care of it, he said again. I went to the party that night, but I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about those bones, that mandible, the sneaker, the melted crown. I scanned the local paper for weeks afterward, waiting to see a headline about human remains discovered in a ravine. Nothing, not a single mention. I even checked the campus police blotter. Nothing, it was like it never happened. A few months later, right around April, there was this girl in the anthropology department named Heather Collins. She was a senior, really social, always organizing study groups and parties. She went to the countdown on New Year's Eve of 1990, and nobody saw her again after that night. The official story was that she'd transferred to a school in California to be closer to her boyfriend. But I remember her friends saying it didn't make sense, that she'd never mentioned transferring, that she'd left all her stuff in her dorm room. Campus security did a welfare check, but since she was an adult and there was no evidence of foul play, they closed the case. I tried to Simmons once, carefully, asking if he'd ever followed up on what we found. He looked at me with this hard expression and told me it had been handled, that the remains were historical and had been logged appropriately. I knew he was lying. I could see it in his eyes. But what was I supposed to do? I was a grad student with no authority and no proof. I had no photos, no documentation, nothing but my memory. Years passed. I finished my degree and went on to study forensic anthropology. I ended up working with law enforcement, analyzing skeletal remains, testifying in court. The work I do now, it's exactly what should have been done back in that ravine in 1989. But it wasn't, and I can't stop thinking about why. In 2003, after I'd established myself in the field, I quietly requested property survey maps for that area outside of town. It took some digging, but I found out the ravine had been sold to a private company in 1991. There were new no trespassing signs posted all around it. The company was registered as a shell corporation with no clear ownership trail. I tried to get permission to access the site for a research project, but my requests were denied without explanation. Professor Simmons retired in 1995. He moved to Arizona citing health reasons. I wrote him a letter once, a few years after he'd left, asking if we could talk about that day. He never responded. He died in 2008. I went to his memorial service and listened to colleagues praise his contributions to the field. Nobody mentioned that ravine. Nobody mentioned New Year's Eve 1989. I still think about those bones. I think about the person they belonged to, whoever they were. I think about Heather Collins and whether there's any connection. I think about the other students who supposedly moved away or dropped out or just vanished from that campus over the years. How many were there? Were any of them connected to the countdown? Were any of them at parties down in that ravine? I've tried to investigate on my own, but I hit walls everywhere I turn. Old police reports are missing or misfiled. The countdown closed in the mid-90s and the owner moved out of state. People I try to interview don't remember or don't want to talk. It's like there's this collective amnesia around it all. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by staying quiet back then. I was young, I was scared, I trusted authority figures to do their jobs. But they didn't, and now decades have passed, and whoever was responsible, if they're even still alive, they got away with it. Those bones are still down there, buried under who knows how many more years of trash and decay, or maybe they're not. Maybe someone went back and cleaned it all up, made sure there was no evidence left to find. I don't know. I'll never know. What I do know is this: if you were in Washington State in the late 80s or early 90s, and you had a friend or a classmate who disappeared around New Year's Eve, especially someone who liked to party at the countdown, you might want to ask some questions. You might want to look into what really happened. Because I don't think Heather Collins moved to California. And I don't think those bones in that ravine were the only ones. I never went back to that town. I can't. Every time I think about it, I see that mandible in my hands, those silver fillings catching the light. I see that melted plastic crown, and I wonder, who were you? What happened to you on New Year's Eve? And why didn't anyone care enough to find out? 3 kids swinging from one bridge on New Year's is easier to explain than 3 murders split across the last night of the year. I'm a crime lab analyst, and I've been working this job for nearly 15 years now. I've seen enough death to know when something doesn't add up. This case still sits in our system labeled group suicide. But I'm telling you, the fibers under my microscope told a completely different story. This happened back in 2010. I was working for the county crime lab in a mid-sized suburban town just outside Seattle, Washington. The town itself was pretty typical. Decent schools, quiet neighborhoods, and a greenbelt canyon that cut right through the middle of everything. Everyone used it as a shortcut. Kids played there, dog walkers went through there every morning. It was just part of the landscape. On New Year's Day, morning around 7 a.m., a woman walking her dog found 3 teenagers hanging from an old footbridge deep in the ravine. The bridge was one of those rickety wooden structures built decades ago, barely maintained, just functional enough that people still crossed it. When the call came in, everyone assumed it was going to be another tragic overdose or maybe an accident. Nobody expected what we found. The scene was grim. 3 kids, all between 16 and 18 years old, suspended from the same beam. Their feet were just inches off the ground. Above them, someone had nailed a crude wooden sign that read, "We gave up before the new year could." The whole thing looked like a coordinated suicide pact. The kind of thing that makes headlines for a week and then disappears into the mental health awareness circuit. I wasn't on scene that day, but I got all the photos and evidence bags 2 days later. Crime scene techs had documented everything. The forested ravine was dark and claustrophobic even in the daytime. Trees closed in overhead and the bridge was slick with moss and old water damage. Snow hadn't stuck down there, so mud and moisture made everything harder to process. I remember spreading out the photographs on my desk and just staring at them for a while. Something felt off immediately, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The ropes were all cut from the same cheap nylon cord, which made sense if they'd planned it together. But when I examined the rope samples under magnification, I noticed something strange. One of the ropes had a factory-finished end clean and sealed. The other two were frayed torn, like they'd been ripped off a longer piece, under tension or in a hurry. That's when the first alarm bell went off in my head. If they'd all prepared together, why would one rope be cut cleanly and the others look rushed? I documented it and moved on to the next piece of evidence. The ligature marks. This is where things got really weird. 2 of the teens showed typical hanging patterns. Pressure marks consistent with suspension after death or near death. But the third kid, a 17-year-old named Chad Miller, had lividity patterns that didn't match. His blood had pooled in a way that suggested he'd been lying down for hours before being suspended. The medical examiner had noted it in passing, but attributed it to body positioning during discovery, which honestly made no sense to me. I ran the numbers again. If Chad had died several hours before the others and then been moved, that changed everything. I kept digging. The so-called suicide note was painted on that wooden sign in what appeared to be one of the girls' handwriting. Her name was Amanda Williams. I requested a handwriting sample from her school records and compared it to high-resolution photos of the sign. The letters matched her style, but under magnification, I could see pressure inconsistencies. Some letters had been traced multiple times, like someone had forced her hand to go over them again and again. It was subtle, but it was there. I'd seen this kind of thing before in coerced confessions and false documents. My stomach started to twist. Then came the toxicology reports. 2 of the teens, including Amanda, tested positive for sedatives, specifically diphenhydramine, Benadryl. High doses enough to make them drowsy and compliant. Chad's blood work came back completely clean. No alcohol, no drugs, nothing. For a supposed suicide pact, that seemed really odd. If they'd all planned to go together, wouldn't they all have taken something to make it easier? I made a note and kept going. Next, I pulled the cell phone records. This is where everything started to unravel. Amanda's phone pinged off a tower near the ravine around 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve. Chad's phone did the same. But the third teen, a 16-year-old girl named Stephanie Jones, had her phone pinging from the ravine at 11 p.m., and then it moved. At 11:47 p.m., her phone was picked up by a tower 2 miles away, heading toward the main highway. At midnight, it powered off completely. That phone was never recovered. If Stephanie had been part of a planned group suicide, why was her phone moving away from the scene right before midnight? I compiled everything into a preliminary report and sent it up to the lead detective on the case. His name was Mark Thompson, and he'd been with the department for over 20 years. I expected him to call me immediately. Instead, I got a short email 2 days later thanking me for my thoroughness and saying he'd take it under advisement. That was it. No follow-up. No request for additional analysis. Nothing. I waited a week and then sent another email asking if he wanted me to pull footage from nearby businesses or gas stations. He didn't respond at all. I couldn't let it go. I knew I was pushing boundaries, but I reached out to a buddy of mine who worked in municipal surveillance systems and asked if he could pull anything from the area around New Year's Eve. He came back with something that made my blood run cold. Security footage from a gas station half a mile from the Greenbelt at 12:15 a.m. on New Year's Day showed a hooded figure buying duct tape and cheap nylon rope. The exact same brand we'd logged into evidence. The person paid in cash kept their head down and left quickly. The height and build matched descriptions of a guy named Greg Smith. Greg was 22 years old and had been dating Stephanie on and off for about a year. Patrol had interviewed him briefly the day after the bodies were found, and he'd been cleared almost immediately because he claimed he was at a party across town. I printed stills from the footage and added them to my file. Then I wrote up a detailed report suggesting that at minimum we had enough inconsistencies to reclassify the case as suspicious death and possibly homicide. I laid out everything: the rope discrepancies, the lividity pattern, the toxicology, the phone records, the surveillance footage. I made copies and submitted it through official channels. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. Then my supervisor called me into her office. She was a woman in her mid-50s named Sharon Reed. She'd always been fair with me, so I thought maybe she was going to tell me the case was being reopened. Instead, she closed the door and asked me to sit down. She told me that my report had been read and appreciated, but that the Detective Bureau had decided the evidence wasn't strong enough to justify reopening the case. She said the families were already devastated, and that pushing for a homicide investigation would tear apart 3 families and half the high school. She told me sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is let people grieve in peace. I remember staring at her, trying to process what she was saying. I asked her point blank if she thought I was wrong. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "I think you're very good at your job, and sometimes that makes things harder." I left her office feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. I kept the file on my desk for another month, but nothing changed. The official narrative stayed the same. A tragic suicide pact fueled by social media despair and teenage hopelessness. The parents did interviews about mental health awareness. There were assemblies at the high school. The Greenbelt saw more patrol presence around New Year's for a while, and then gradually it faded. Greg Smith moved out of state 6 months later. I checked in on him a couple times over the years. Just out of curiosity, he's still out there living his life. I tried to move on, but every time a case came across my desk, with inconsistencies, I thought about those 3 kids hanging from that bridge. A few years ago, I ended up walking through that Greenbelt on a weekend. I don't know why I went there. Maybe I just needed to see it for myself. I followed the trail down into the ravine and found the old footbridge. It was even more weathered than it had been in the photos, barely holding together. I stopped underneath it and looked up at the beam where the ropes had been tied. Someone had scrubbed most of the graffiti off the underside of the planks, but I could still make out faint spray paint letters, half visible in the wood grain. It read, "He promised only one of us had to go." I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. If Stephanie had written that before she died, if someone else had written it afterward, I'll never know. And the case is still officially closed. The file still says group suicide. But I know what I saw under that microscope, and I know what those phone records showed. 3 kids didn't decide together to end their lives on New Year's Eve. At least one of them was already dead hours before the others were strung up. Someone staged that scene, and someone walked away. I still think about it. I think about Chad and Amanda and Stephanie and what their last hours must have been like. I think about Greg and whether he's ever looked back or if he sleeps just fine at night. I think about that message scratched into the wood. Mostly, though, I think about how easy it is to close a case when the alternative is too ugly to face. 3 teenagers dead on the first day of the year makes people want answers that feel simple. Nobody wants to believe that one of them might have been murdered and the others might have been coerced or drugged into a scene that looked like a pact. It's easier to call it despair and move on. But I've looked at enough evidence to know the difference between a story that holds together and one that's been arranged. And this one was arranged. Someone planned it, someone executed it, and someone got away with it. Every New Year's Eve since then, I think about that bridge and those 3 kids and that factory finished rope end. I think about the phone that powered off at midnight and the sedatives in their systems and the surveillance footage nobody wanted to follow up on. I think about Sharon telling me to let them rest. Maybe she was right. Maybe digging it all up wouldn't have brought them back or given their families any peace. But it bothers me. It bothers me that the file says one thing and the evidence says another. It bothers me that someone is out there who knows exactly what happened and they've never had to answer for it. It bothers me that I did everything I was supposed to do, and it didn't matter. I don't know if that makes me a bad analyst or just someone who cares too much. Either way, I can't forget it. I can't forget that crude wooden sign, or the way the ligature marks didn't match, or the way that one rope was cut clean while the others were torn. I don't go back to that green belt anymore. I don't need to. I see it every time I close my eyes. I see those 3 kids and I see the truth that nobody wanted to hear. And I know that somewhere out there someone else sees it too. Maybe they're proud of what they got away with. Maybe they're terrified someone will figure it out. Maybe they've convinced themselves it was justified or necessary or somehow not their fault. I don't know. But I know this. 3 kids didn't hang themselves from that bridge because they gave up on the new year. They died because someone decided their lives were expendable. And the worst part is we let that someone walk away. That's what keeps me up at night. Not the evidence or the inconsistencies or even the unanswered questions. It's the fact that we had everything we needed to pursue the truth, and we chose not to. We chose the easier story. We chose to let families grieve quietly rather than rip open wounds with an investigation that might not lead anywhere. And maybe that was the right call. Maybe compassion mattered more than justice in that moment. But I'll never stop wondering what would have happened if we'd pushed harder. If we'd brought Greg back in for real questioning. If we'd tracked down that phone. If we'd treated it like the crime I know it was. I still have copies of everything. The rope analysis, the toxicology, the phone records, the surveillance stills, I keep them in a folder at the back of my filing cabinet at home. I don't know why. Maybe someday someone will reopen it. Maybe someday new evidence will surface and I'll be able to hand over everything I found. Or maybe it'll just sit there gathering dust while I get older and those 3 kids stay frozen in time hanging from a bridge that should have been torn down years ago. That's the thing about this job. You see the truth, and sometimes the truth doesn't matter. Sometimes the story people need is more important than the story the evidence tells. And you have to live with that. You have to wake up every day and go back to the lab and process more evidence and write more reports and hope that next time it'll be different. But it's not always different. Sometimes the answer is right in front of everyone and nobody wants to see it. So yeah, 3 kids on a bridge on New Year's Day. The file says suicide pact. The evidence says something else. And somewhere out there, the person who knows exactly what happened is living their life while I'm still thinking about factory-finished rope ends and phone records and half-scrubbed graffiti. I don't know what else to do with it except tell someone. So I'm telling you, make of it what you will. His last call was about empty tents with hot stoves. Not thin ice, yet that's what they wrote on the report. This happened back in 2015 on New Year's Eve. I was working as a park ranger in a gateway town just outside one of Washington's bigger national forests. The kind of place where the trees are so thick, you can walk 50 feet off the trail and feel like you've stepped into a different world entirely. I'd been with the service for about 3 years at that point, doing mostly patrol work and occasional search and rescue. It was decent work and I liked being outside even when the weather turned miserable. That winter had been particularly brutal with snow coming down harder and earlier than usual. The ranger I'm about to tell you about was named Gary Bloom. He was a veteran, maybe 15 years with the service. Everyone called him Bloom. He was one of those guys who knew the forest better than the back of his own hand. Quiet, competent, not the type to take unnecessary risks. We weren't close friends, but we worked together enough that I trusted his judgment completely. Bloom was scheduled to work New Year's Eve, which wasn't unusual. Most of the younger rangers with families tried to get the holiday off, so guys like him and me ended up covering the shifts. I didn't mind. Spending New Year's Eve alone in my apartment didn't sound appealing anyway. That afternoon, Bloom came into the ranger station saying he'd gotten a tip about fresh grow activity up near the northern patrol sector. Illegal marijuana grows were a constant problem in our park. Growers would hike deep into the backcountry, set up tents and irrigation systems, and essentially turn remote clearings into hidden farms. It was dangerous work trying to bust them. These people didn't want to be found, and some of them were armed. Bloom told me he wanted to check it out before the year flipped so the paperwork would stay clean for the annual reports. That was typical Bloom, always thinking about the always bureaucratic side of things. I was the one logging patrol routes that day, so I wrote down his plan. He'd take a snowmobile up to the old patrol cabin near Pinewood Ridge, then hike out to check the suspected coordinates. He figured he'd be back by dark. The weather forecast that morning had called for light snow, but nothing serious. By early afternoon, though, the sky started looking uglier than expected. I radioed Bloom around 2 p.m. suggesting he postpone the run, but he said he was already halfway there and didn't want to turn back for nothing. That was the last normal conversation we had. Around 4 p.m., the snow really started coming down. I'm talking full blizzard conditions with visibility dropping to almost nothing. I kept checking the GPS tracker on dispatch monitors. Every ranger's radio had a breadcrumb feature that pinged location data every 15 minutes. Bloom's signal showed him moving steadily north. Then it stopped just past the patrol cabin coordinates. I wasn't too worried at first. Sometimes the trackers glitched in heavy weather, and besides, Bloom knew that cabin like his own house. He'd wait out the storm there. Around 5 p.m., his voice crackled over the radio. The signal was weak and full of static, but I could make out most of what he said. He told me he'd reached the area and found more tents than he expected. He said something about them not hiding this year. His tone wasn't panicked, but it was cautious. I asked him if he needed backup, and he paused before saying he'd call back in 20 minutes after he got a better look. That pause stuck with me. It wasn't like him to hesitate. Then the transmission cut out. I figured it was just the storm messing with the signal. I waited for his call back. 20 minutes passed, then 40, then an hour. By 6 p.m., I was starting to worry. I tried raising him on the radio over and over, but got nothing back except static. His final transmission came through around 6:30. It was so broken up, I almost didn't catch it. I had to replay the recording 3 times to piece it together. His voice was quieter this time, almost like he was trying not to be heard. He said something about the tents being empty. Then he said, "Why are they all empty?" There was wind in the background and the distinct crunch of his boots on snow. That was it. The transmission cut mid-sentence and his GPS signal went completely dead. I knew something was wrong. Bloom wouldn't just go dark like that, especially not in a blizzard. I immediately notified my supervisor, and within an hour we had a search operation being organized for first light. Nobody was going out in that storm at night. It would have been suicide. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying that last transmission in my head. Why are they all empty? What did that mean? By 7 a.m. the next morning, the storm had finally cleared enough for us to move. I volunteered to lead the search team along with 2 other rangers. We loaded up snowmobiles and headed out toward the patrol cabin. The ride took about 90 minutes through fresh powder. When we finally reached the cabin, I felt my stomach drop. Bloom's snowmobile was parked right out front. The keys were still in it and his pack was strapped to the back, exactly how he would have left it. But there was no sign of Bloom himself. The snow around the cabin was a mess. There were boot prints everywhere, none of them matching the deep lug pattern of Bloom's standard issue boots. I counted at least 3 different tread patterns, maybe more. That didn't make sense. Who else would be out here on New Year's Eve in a blizzard? We approached the cabin carefully. The door was unlocked. Inside, the wood stove was still warm, which meant someone had been there recently. I looked around trying to piece together what had happened. The patrol cabin was small, just 1 room with a table, a couple of bunks, and storage for emergency supplies. Everything looked relatively normal except for one thing: the logbook that every ranger was supposed to sign when using the cabin was sitting on the table, but the last several pages had been torn out. Clean tears, like someone had ripped them deliberately. I checked the walls. There was a map of the sector pinned up with red marker circles drawn around several clearings. I recognized Bloom's handwriting. One of the circles had a label next to it that just said NYE Camp. I pulled the map down and folded it carefully. That's when I opened the table drawer and found something that made my blood run cold. It was a cheap flip phone. Not the kind of radio or GPS unit we carried, just a basic prepaid cell. I turned it on. The battery was low, but it still worked. In the outbox, there were several unsent text messages. No recipient, just draft texts with GPS coordinates and short notes. One said 10 tents, no people. Another said, generator still warm. The last one made my hands shake. It said, smell in the trees. I showed the phone to the other rangers. None of us knew what to make of it. Why would Bloom have a burner phone? And what did he mean by smell in the trees? We decided to follow the coordinates from the map, starting with the one labeled NYE Camp. It took us another hour of snowmobile travel to reach the clearing. When we got there, I knew immediately something was very wrong. The snow in the clearing looked disturbed. Not just footprints, but large, irregular patches where it seemed like something had been dragged or dug up, then hastily covered. I got off my snowmobile and started walking the perimeter. That's when I saw them. Tent poles. At least a dozen of them sticking up through the snow at odd angles, like someone had packed up in a hurry but left the frames behind. One of the other rangers started probing the snow with a collapsible pole. About 20 feet from the tree line, he hit something solid. We all converged on the spot and started digging carefully with our hands. What we uncovered made me feel sick. It was a shallow, wide pit, maybe 10 feet across, filled with frozen soil and branches. The soil was dark, almost black, and it didn't belong there. This was clearly excavated from somewhere else and dumped here. I was about to dig deeper when I heard the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors. I looked up. A Park Service chopper was descending toward the clearing. That was strange. Nobody had called for air support. The helicopter landed and out stepped a man I'd never seen before. He was dressed in a heavy parka with a ranger patch, but his uniform looked too clean, too new. He walked straight toward us with an authority that made it clear he outranked everyone present. He didn't introduce himself. He just told us in a calm but firm voice that we were to search for the missing ranger only, and that they would handle this site later. I started to protest, but he cut me off. He said the situation was now under the jurisdiction of a specialized unit, and that our job was to find Bloom, nothing else. The other rangers looked at me. I could see the confusion and frustration in their faces, but what could we do? We backed off and continued searching the surrounding area for any sign of Bloom. We didn't find him. Not that day or the next or the week after that. Within 3 days, I was quietly rotated off the case. My supervisor told me that the official conclusion was that Bloom had likely fallen through river ice while crossing alone and been swept downstream. I knew that was nonsense. Bloom never mentioned a lake or river in his last transmission. He was talking about tents. I tried to bring up the flip phone and the map, but I was told those items were no longer in evidence. They disappeared. Just gone. I felt like I was losing my mind. I started asking questions, reaching out to other rangers, trying to piece together what had really happened. That's when I got called into a closed-door meeting with 2 men in suits. They weren't rangers. They told me very politely that it was in everyone's best interest if I accepted the official story and moved on. They didn't threaten me outright, but the message was clear. About a month later, a body was found by fishermen downstream, about 15 miles from where Bloom had last been seen. The face was unrecognizable, degraded by time in the water, they said. But the uniform was intact except the name tag was missing. The family opted for a closed casket and cremation. The funeral was small and quiet. I attended. I shook hands with Bloom's brother and his elderly mother. I didn't tell them what I knew. What good would it have done? The Park Service released a brief statement. Another tragic loss. A dedicated ranger taken too soon by the unforgiving wilderness. Case closed. But I can't close it, not in my head. I've gone over that day 1,000 times trying to make sense of it. Bloom found something out there. Not a marijuana grow, something worse. Those empty tents with generators still running, that smell in the trees, the hastily covered pit filled with soil that didn't belong. I think he stumbled onto a dump site. Not for trash. For something else. And I think someone inside the service decided it was safer to bury the evidence and Bloom along with it. Who does that? Why there? Why then? I left the Park Service 6 months later. I couldn't keep working there knowing what I knew, or at least what I suspected. I still think about Bloom, especially this time of year. I think about his last words. Why are they all empty? I don't have an answer. Maybe I never will. But I know one thing. The forest kept his secret and someone made sure it stayed that way.